My name is Daniel Pine, and I'm going to be providing you with an introduction about some key issues concerning the anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are some of the most common conditions that afflict individuals in the world, with a prevalence as high as 20%. And there are a range of anxiety disorders. I'll be describing some of them for you, but this lecture is going to focus on the common features shared across the anxiety disorders. I work at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, and I have a long background from studying the anxiety disorders. This interest focuses on many different areas, developmental aspects of the anxiety disorders, treatment studies, and I'll be emphasizing both of these in the comments that I'll be making over the next 15 to 20 minutes. In terms of relevant conflicts of interest, I am a paid editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, but have no relationships with pharmaceutical companies or other relevant entities. For people who are interested in book-length treatment of some of the material that I'll be reviewing, I recommend these two books, Joe Ledoux's book, Anxious, and the book by Lucy Folks, which has the title of Losing Our Minds, published in Europe, or What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't in the United States. I'll be talking about three general issues: broad clinical features of the anxiety disorders, life course aspects of presentation and risk factors, and a few key findings about biology and treatment. I'll be talking relatively broadly about clinical features of the anxiety disorders, and one point to make concerning all the different aspects of anxiety is the difference between abnormal aspects of anxiety, which are features of anxiety disorders, and normal features of anxiety. We all experience anxiety in situations that are threatening, and this is a normal part of human experience. Anxiety becomes part of an anxiety disorder when it impairs our functioning. That means when anxiety prevents us from doing things that we can typically do or that other people in the same situation can do, anxiety produces impairment, which is a sign of a disorder. And this usually presents with avoidance, fear of doing something that most other people can do. Anxiety presents in many conditions. We will be talking about the anxiety disorders, but it also presents in conditions like OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can learn about these disorders and some of the features you see listed here in other talks concerning these other conditions. While anxiety is shared in OCD, PTSD, and the other conditions that you can see listed here, my comments are going to primarily focus on these other conditions that include social anxiety, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, and other conditions. These other conditions can be distinguished based on their clinical features. So panic disorder is characterized by recurrent, spontaneous panic attacks, which are sudden episodes of severe anxiety that is typically associated with many autonomic symptoms. So feelings of your heart beating fast or difficulty breathing. And these unique features clinically are also thought to relate to unique biology. Social anxiety disorder is another condition. This one is associated with intense fear of situations where humiliation is possible. And this disorder has been linked to certain temperaments that we see in childhood, such as one called behavioral inhibition. Specific phobia refers to anxiety about particular objects, such as heights or other situations, or small animals and other objects that are capable of harming us. Specific phobia is unique because it has a relatively good clinical prognosis compared to the other disorders. And then finally, generalized anxiety disorder, which is characterized by a pattern of recurrent worries. And this condition is unique by showing strong relations with virtually all the other anxiety disorders, as well as mood disorders like major depressive disorder. So those are some of the clinical features of the anxiety disorders. What about aspects of their life course and risk factors? So this slide shows you various kinds of mental health conditions, such as the neurodevelopmental disorders, which you see illustrated here, the psychotic disorders, which you see illustrated here, and the emotional disorders, which you see illustrated in gray to indicate the predominant role of environmental factors in the pathophysiology of the emotional disorders. And this slide is designed to show you that there is a progressive shift in the features of the emotional disorders across development. Conditions like specific phobia typically arise early in life. Slightly later, this leads to associations with social anxiety disorder. And then still later in life, we see generalized anxiety disorder and its association with major depressive disorder. Now, when we examine children and follow them over time, we see that anxiety disorders often arise early and give rise to other conditions. And this slide shows you results from a longitudinal study that I was fortunate enough to help complete with colleagues at Columbia University over the last 30 years or so. And this shows you data that relates anxiety disorders in adolescents to problems that we see in adults. And there are three main findings to take away from this slide. Number one, as I mentioned at the beginning, anxiety disorders are extremely common, both in children and in adults. You see that 253 out of these 679 individuals will have suffered from an anxiety disorder. Number two, in children, anxiety disorders are usually transient. 191 of the 253 individuals who had anxiety disorders in adolescence were free of any emotional disorder as adults. This is less true in adults. Disorders that are present in adults tend to be more persistent than they are in children, and that partly relates to the early onset of anxiety disorders, such that when we see them in adults, and this shows you here, there are 98 adults who had either a mood or an anxiety disorder. The problem usually started in childhood. 62 of the 98 adults who were afflicted with an emotional disorder had their problem begin as an anxiety disorder in childhood that persisted, and this might explain the more persistent nature of anxiety disorders in adults, that the conditions have usually been present for a long time when we see an anxiety disorder in adults. Well, what about risk factors? Risk factors are thought to accumulate to lead to anxiety disorders in a way where no single underlying factor plays a major role, but it is the complex combination of risk factors that lead to anxiety disorders. This includes genetics, where genes play a relatively minor role, perinatal factors, illnesses, social experiences such as exclusion, aspects of the parent-child relationship, and all of these factors throughout childhood and adolescence interact, each individual factor playing a relatively minor role to accumulate and underlie risk for anxiety disorders that ultimately manifest in adolescence and adulthood. What about biology and treatment? Again, these are two areas where we know a lot relative to features that are shared across the anxiety disorders. Much of what we know comes from studies in non-human organisms, either rodents or non-human primates, and this delineates underlying neural circuitry that you can see illustrated here, that it is engaged by threats that are stimuli that are capable of harming the organism. We tend to think of threats along a continuum of proximity. So some threats like this bear are relatively distant, they're far away, and they engage some aspects of this circuitry and lead to some behaviors like avoidance or attending. Other threats, such as this angry individual, are more proximal. They might engage other parts of this neural circuitry and lead to other behaviors, such as freezing or fleeing. And still other threats, such as a shock that's delivered to our wrist, can be immediately in front of us, and these might lead to other responses and relate to other circuitry, such as flight. We've tried to capitalize on what we know about underlying circuitry to lead to clinical breakthroughs. And this slide illustrates what we know about the neural circuitry of attention. And you can see that that's illustrated here in this picture, where this individual's attention is captured by this snake. And we have mapped the circuitry of attention using brain imaging, and we have outlined specific behaviors that relate to attention, and some novel treatments are being discovered based on this aspect of attention-related brain circuitry. Similarly, we are trying to use what we know from brain imaging studies to come up with new biological tests. Some that, such as this, that are illustrated here, an MRI test, we can think of as relatively invasive tests in cardiology that we're hopefully going to use only in a minority of patients, and others, such as EEG, that you can see illustrated here, that we might think of as similar to a stress test that we're going to use in wider groups of individuals. And this is really the hope of some of the biological research that you'll hear about in other talks, that it's going to help us come up with tests like the stress test in cardiology that we don't yet have, to help tell us things about clinical presentation, how it's going to unfold over time. Now, there are a lot of treatments that are available for anxiety disorders that are quite useful, and we tend to think about these in two categories. Probably the first line treatment is a form of psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. There is strong data to show that this is efficacious in all of the anxiety disorders, and it relies on a procedure that we call exposure, where the individual patient works with their therapist to face their fears and to learn how to overcome them. Now, most patients do derive some benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy, but it is not easy, as it requires a lot of work on the part of the patient, and it requires the patient to actually face their fears, and that is too difficult for some patients. For those patients, or for other patients who do not have access to cognitive behavioral therapy, antidepressant medications are also highly efficacious. There are many different kinds of antidepressant medications that have been shown to work. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, are probably the best studied medication, and they have been shown to work in virtually all forms of anxiety disorders, as well as obsessive compulsive disorder and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, those two other conditions I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Specific phobias are the one condition where the antidepressants have not been shown to work. There's been some debate about whether some medications are particularly efficacious, more efficacious than others, and the jury is still out on that issue. The bottom line is that most of the antidepressant medications are efficacious, and they differ mostly in their side effects. In general, the side effects of the antidepressant medications are usually quite mild, but a minority of individuals will have side effects that are problematic. And this is probably what leads cognitive behavioral therapy to often be recommended before the SSRIs. But for patients, again, who do not have access to CBT, they should realize that most patients tolerate medications quite well. The things where there are the greatest worry are what we call the behavioral side effects. So this refers to that the antidepressants can make some individuals feel worse. And probably the best example is showed in this slide for individuals who are younger than the age of 25. You see that they are associated with thoughts about suicide. Again, this should not dissuade patients from using them when they're the best option, but they often lead people to try CBT first. Well, so this was a relatively quick talk. I really took only 15 minutes or so to talk to you about some of the broad features about the anxiety disorders. We talked both about their clinical features and their life course and associated risk factors, as well as their biology and treatment. And I would encourage you to view the other associated talks to learn more features about the specific anxiety disorders. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy this brief presentation.